Well, Sasha, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. Just going to start off by asking you to just talk a little bit about who you are and how did you get into your line of work and what your backstory is.
Oh, really interesting question, and I'll try and keep it short and interesting.
No, no,
Um,
elaborate.
I'm sure we'll go off on a few tangents through this anyway,
No
so
Yeah.
fee.
feel free because the backstory I would say would invite us to talk about certain things in more detail. So feel free to jump in if anything piques your interest. So I'm Saša Harper. I'm an ADHD coach. I haven't always been an ADHD coach. My first life was in physics. I was a high school physics teacher for about 10 years. And I kept on burning out, like really poor mental health, cycles of just like burnout, mental and physical illness. Kept on trying to push through, kept on using the good old things like cigarettes and alcohol.
Mm.
Realized after a point that wasn't working for me. And then I hit kind of like a longer burnout and actually went to the doctors. And but first of all, got diagnosed with chronic high functioning anxiety. But during like a mental health triage, the guy was like to me, "Do you think you've got ADHD?" And I was like, "No." Because at that point, as a high school teacher, my internalized bias of what ADHD was essentially Bart Simpson, because God love the young lad. I still remember him in my first
Mhm.
school. He was the only child I knew openly diagnosed with ADHD and absolutely fit that stereotype. So even years later, it wasn't in the school systems. Um, but yeah, so after that, I realized teaching wasn't for me, and I worked for the Institute of Physics. In that, I did lots of coaching and did a lot on actually stereotypes and D&I, diversity and inclusion, and unconscious bias, and how we make decisions, and how stereotypes influence our choices at school, influence our identity at school, and our mental health. So there was just kind of moved into a bit more awareness of how we work, how we operate, how that affects learning, how that affects us to be able to be present and show up in different ways. And then eventually it came more and more apparent that maybe I do have ADHD. So I went and got an assessment, and that was in 2019. And then through around the same time and COVID and all that jazz, I was exposed to nervous system regulation and how that has a relationship to neurodivergence like ADHD. And it impacted me personally, it impacted me professionally. And then in March 2021, I decided to go on my own and support people to improve their mental, physical, financial, professional lives who have ADHD generally. I also have an autism diagnosis that came later. Um, but yeah, ultimately, that's where I came from. That's where I am.
Wow, there's like you say, there's a lot to unpack there and to talk about further. Just first of all, as a former teacher myself, I can totally relate to the burnout and the stress and the anxiety, and yeah, it was exactly the same for me. It took like a massive health crisis to like leave the teaching profession, and I have so much respect for teachers, but my God, it's a tough gig, that one. Um, and yeah, and it's funny because I was literally having this conversation with someone a couple of days ago about ADHD and how,
Mhm.
it seems to be in the mainstream a lot more nowadays. We're talking about it a lot more. It's more well known, it's more spoken about. And my experience as a teacher, and I was primary, so as I was younger children, was the sort of diagnosed and medicated children that literally could not function without medication, and they were bouncing off the walls and jumping on the tables and like couldn't function in the classroom because of their ADHD. And so for me, it's been really tricky to get my head around that and to hear all these people saying like, "Oh, I've got ADHD and I've got ADHD," and so just to start off, could you explain to us what actually is ADHD?
Well, so with my background being in science, I've taken the best approach I possibly can to that question because there is a nature element from all accounts. There's a lot on genetics, like there's many studies that would corroborate there is a genetic component to ADHD. There's also an environmental one. So nurture, how is that showing up? So what is ADHD? just going to kind of like touch on the mainstream side of it. So what we might see in the mainstream is things is like exactly what you said, Sophie, that classic can't sit still, forgetting everything, bumping into things, just like generally chaos personified
Mhm.
is what we may have an understanding currently as things have moved on in social media around ADHD. In terms of what's actually happening in the brain, so you've got the newest part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and that helps with logic, reasoning, attention, focus, working memory, and emotional regulation. So when we look at ADHD from that perspective, it's kind of like there's a poorer functioning in this area. And that poorer functioning impacts person's behavior, their ability to regulate their emotions, their ability to remember things, their ability to with time management, and all of these things that we'd look at the classic symptoms of ADHD. So my answer to what is ADHD, as it stands, like an understanding would be a weaker prefrontal cortex, which then presents inside of a person a set of symptoms which I would say are becoming more widely known and accepted in the adult sphere, as you said, not just that classic younger child bouncing off the walls. Does that answer your question, or is it a bit vague?
No, absolutely. It definitely does. And so, when you're talking about the prefrontal cortex, you're talking sort of from a scientific, physical perspective. Now, I know
Mm.
you've have you done some work with Gabor Mate and
Yeah.
talked a lot about sort of like trauma-induced ADHD.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that? Like, what is that? I feel like that's something that people know less about, and certainly something I haven't really heard too much about until recently.
For sure. And this is where, again, where are we at? September 2024. This is my opinion in
Mm.
2024. As with all good data and opinions and beliefs, they can change over time. Where I'm at with that and what I understand from Gabor Mate is essentially when we look at trauma, am I okay to just give a definition of which I will be speaking to? It might not be everyone's definition.
Absolutely, yeah.
So when using the word trauma right now, what I mean by that is an event or a series of events which creates a long-term dysregulation of the nervous system, which means a person is unable to respond the way they want to in the current moment.
Mm. Such a good definition.
So what I mean by that is you could have two people who are exposed to the exact same event. One of them experiences trauma, one of them doesn't. Now, this is where the Gabor Mate piece might make sense. So when we're looking at that genetic piece, it is likely from all the evidence that the genetic piece means the person is more highly sensitive. Highly sensitive is just on a scale. Highly sensitive people tend to be more creative, more empathetic, more creative in problem solving.
Mm.
So it's not good or bad, it's just relative. However, that person who is more sensory is more likely to experience trauma from the same event. Because what we're basically saying, thinking of us as like a meat sack, sorry to sound so gross, just to be like, just for the analogy, it's like, or meat antennas. We take in information, we process that information, we make meaning of that information. So if two people are experiencing the same event, if you have the more sensitive meat antenna, your system may be overloaded more easily, and therefore you'll have that trauma response. Therefore, the body is saying like, whoa, that was too much. I need to do something to cope with that. And why would trauma occur? Trauma would occur when somebody's body doesn't have the capacity to deal with what's happening inside. So it could be what people tend to refer to as big T trauma, like, and I hate to use the word classic abuse.
Mm.
Or it could be what people refer to as little T trauma, which is events over time, like emotional neglect is coming into that. And what do we mean by emotional neglect? It may be very unintentional, where somebody's emotional needs aren't getting met. Because in this context, let's think about what an emotion is. An emotion is a piece of sensory data that comes through the body. If, say, let's think of a child goes through an event that creates a big emotion, not a good one, like fear, shame, guilt, something like that. They have this big emotion. And if they don't feel safe inside of their body to deal with that rush of data, the body's going to do something to help them deal with that. So the brain may check out, which is another sign of ADHD, dissociation.
Mm.
Vary the focus so you don't have to be present inside of your body with that sensation.
Mm.
So,
No, it's really interesting. Yeah, just for me, it's a brand new sort of concept having, you hear about people that have ADHD and these symptoms that are associated with that, but it's the fact that trauma can kind of, would you say trauma can cause ADHD, or is it more ADHD is kind of heightened sensitivity and trauma can kind of bring the symptoms out in people?
from what I know, in September 2024, I would say the latter.
Mm.
Um, it again depends where you look at things, because actually, when you look at a fetus in utero, the higher cortisol levels of stress inside of the mother affects brain function. So again, is it nature? Is it nurture? Does it run in families? Because the way your emotions were tended to, generally between the ages of 0 to 7, are the way that your blueprint will do that in 1/100th of a second with your own children without a level of conscious awareness to change.
Mm. Yeah, so it's kind
So,
of
yeah,
sort of like the nature nurture debate, but
uh,
also they're kind of interlinked as well, right?
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So, just like linking back to the work that I do, I actually work with people who don't have an ADHD diagnosis. It's who meets the symptoms, and ultimately the relationship between the nervous system and that brain function, that is so pivotal, whether whatever brain you've got, but it's even more important when you've got a weaker prefrontal cortex. Because ultimately, when we're talking about the nervous system, we're talking about inner safety or outer safety or perception of safety and how the body's responding. And it will send resources depending on that assessment to the brain or away from the brain, or back to the more primitive parts of the brain where we're going to experience anxiety or depression or anything like that.
Mm.
So are those, like you say, like anxiety and depression, are they common signs of an unregulated system?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Because when you look at the three main parts of the nervous system, well, of the autonomic nervous system, there's like a really nice, it's called the polyvagal theory ladder, or the autonomic ladder. It shows us that when we, right, let's imagine that everyone's feeling safe. Everyone's having a lovely time. This is in the newest part of the brain and the ventral vagal complex. Like, it's the system of safety and social engagement. And that means if you are in that system of safety and social engagement, your prefrontal cortex is online, everyone's having a nice time. In those moments, you can basically, you might see like phrases like be your best self,
Mm.
be your authentic self. That literally means that you feel safe enough to express your opinion, to put boundaries in, to make choices that protect your needs and your communities and your drive and your ideas. Problem is, when you don't feel safe, you'll drop down into the next one, which is 400 million years old. And that is known as our fight or flight. And that's where things like anxiety, overthinking, overwhelm, stress, that's the one where that lives. It's like, I need to take action to make myself safe. I need
Mm.
to run towards or run away from something.
Yeah.
And that happens on a micro scale at work, generally, or in life.
Yeah, I think everyone listening can probably relate to that. But just so we're clear, can you maybe give us a few signs that someone's in emotional dysregulation? Like what can you look out for so that we know like, oh, I'm dysregulated right now?
Yeah, brilliant. That's such a good question. So, especially in that fight or flight one. So, if there is thinking of urgency, I have to make a decision. If there's rumination, like I have to make the right decision. There is a fear that the decision has to be made quickly, and it has to be the right decision or there'll be consequence. A fear of expressing themselves, a fear of not meeting someone's expectations. If those feelings of like perfectionism are coming in, like you don't want to embarrass yourself, or if you're working with a team, like you don't want to let people down, people pleasing, all of these things, feeling just overwhelmed, stressed. They're really good indicators that you are dysregulated and stuck in fight or flight. And then as we go down, it's like if we can't mobilize, we have to protect ourselves with immobilization. So that's where it gets more like depression, procrastination. Even though procrastination is kind of usually a mixture of the two, it's kind of like when we really shut down. And that's where there's like low self-esteem, and there's more hopelessness, there's more apathy, there's more just what we would, I would assume people would understand more in like depressive-like symptoms. However, one amazing thing about this information is understanding why it happens, and once you notice it, what you can do about it. Because if we go back to that, everyone's having a lovely time. Now, I use this analogy a lot. I've never been hiking in the woods and experienced this, so we're just going to go with the analogy, and hopefully it's going to make sense to everyone. So let's imagine that you are having a lovely time in the woods and you're in a place where bears exist. Now, let's imagine everyone's feeling really good. We're in nature with people that we trust, feeling good in our ventral vagal, it's called ventral vagal complex. We're feeling safe, we're feeling socially engaged. And then you see in your peripheral a bear. Now, what's going to happen at 1/100th of a second is you're going to mobilize. If it's at a certain distance, your system's going to mobilize for fight or flight. And then as you're processing all of that, the bear is like so close to you. So you have no choice but to go into immobilization. Right. So let's just go back to that depressive, like shame, kind of not feeling good enough state of mind, and why it's actually so useful. Now, useful in terms of larger neurobiology, not useful when you're trying to send an email to your boss. But think about what's happening in that situation when that bear is really close to you. You have to stop. You have to like your body's taking you out in some form. And your body has to work together to keep you like that till the threat has passed, till the bear has moved away. Now, what is the most important internal narrative for that? You're useless. It's hopeless. You cannot fight that bear. You are not good enough. Like literally do not move. It's just stay there. That narrative is life-saving. It is not life-saving when someone is suffering depression on their own, but in that particular situation, realizing that you do not have the resources to fight a bear is absolutely essential to keep you alive. So when that part of the nervous system is activated, it makes a lot of sense. Those things happen when we're isolated. So COVID was a massive trigger for most people because, there's a kind of reciprocity between the nervous system internal environment and external. We don't just isolate when we're depressed. If we're isolated, we will get depressed. Rule of thumb, in general terms.
Yeah.
So those different parts of the nervous system have different function. The problem is we're meant to be operating at this one, the top one, the safe and secure, most of the time. Well, unfortunately, maybe it's a circle that I've been in, many adults aren't.
Yeah, so interesting. Like you say, we live in a society where we're like, it's so safe. We have, like Uber Eats and like you can go anywhere you want, you can travel, you can like order stuff online and it comes the next day, and like, you can email. People are working from home now. They don't even have to get out of their pajamas if they don't want to. Like we have such safe, cushy lives, and yet we're still, our bodies are still running in this kind of like reptilian stage where someone says something that triggers us, or oh, did that person like mean to, like, were they insulting me, or like, oh,
Mm.
did my boss just say, was that passive aggressive? And then we go into these kind of like, what, it's like really old parts of us. And I know that I can speak for myself when I say, doesn't feel like you have any control when you're in that place, and you're like, I'm going to send a really aggressive text back, and like no one can stop me from doing it. Do you know what I mean? It's just so hard to put on the brakes, and it can be like life ruining in some situations, you know, if you're like sending the angry email or the angry text, and yeah, blowing up your work and your friendships and your relationships and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where, like, this, from my perspective, the nervous system regulation and awareness is such a graceful intervention for so many people, because you are 100% right. These triggers are happening way outside of your consciousness. They are
Mm.
happening because your past experiences and how you interpreted them. And, you know, our faces are constantly, sorry, our nervous system are constantly scanning each other's faces for, where are their eyes? Where's their mouth? Like, are they safe? Are they going to be a threat? And if we've had trauma, we may actually be misinterpreting what's happening there. So there's so many pieces going on. So you're 100% right. Like, in the moment, that's all you want to do. Because going back to the bear analogy, when the bear's far away enough or looks small enough, like, is that a baby bear? Could I fight that baby bear? You
Yeah.
need to be like, right, I am ready to go. I am mobilized. Like, you are absolutely not, you know, harming me and mine. So
Yeah.
it's like, again, realizing that your desire to take action in those moments make perfect sense. The grace of the nervous system piece is realizing that the second that you notice it, like, you can notice it in terms of sensation, you can notice it in terms of thoughts, like, and then what can you do to pause before you respond, to regulate, to get back into safety, to then make conscious decisions? Because for all intents and purposes, your logical brain's gone offline, and it's not a decision that the actual authentic you would want to make. And you know, that's where it is absolutely relationship saving, friendship saving, life saving, not to make these choices from those older parts of ourselves, or depends if you're looking at it from an emotional trauma lens, the younger parts of ourselves.
Mm.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk to you briefly about dopamine because obviously, you know, as people with ADHD, they want loads of dopamine, want dopamine fixes constantly, like because it makes us feel good. And we live in a time where dopamine is very available. You know, whether it's social media, text messaging, all those kind of things, we can get very much instantaneous dopamine. And I wondered if, again, going back to that regulation, that we need to be more aware of the fact that we need those good fixes of dopamine rather than these easy fixes.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, well, you've hit the nail on the head. It's so available and it's so mean, because you know, the people who need it the most need more conscious energy and effort to override, like, those desires to move towards the dopamine. Now, what's really interesting as well is it's a holistic approach, and what's wild is how simple all of these things are. But let's not complicate simple and easy, because 50% of dopamine's made in the gut.
Mm.
And Sophie was talking about Uber Eats and diet and lifestyle and movement, and there's certain ways that we can reset our receptors, which is being in nature and not on the dopamine slot machine, which is the phone. So this is again where the nervous system piece, I feel, removes blame, because I haven't found an ADHD yet who doesn't know what they need to be doing better, but struggles to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's understanding that the relationship between, you know, their gut, their nervous system, their brain is all going to have a role on the decisions that they make. So the dopamine, like, the way I got into this, so in 2020, I made a meme page called ADHD Dopamine. And I just had to stop it, because I realized that what I was speaking about in general terms was dysregulated ADHD rather than regulated ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's really interesting. Like, dopamine is well known, but ultimately, I would actually say, and I am this is again an opinion that I've formed at this point, I would actually say we are more driven for safety than we are dopamine. Because a lot of ADHDers struggle to have that sense of internal safety. So they may go for some level of self-soothing or a feel-good chemical or behavior that would induce the chemical. But when a person gets to experience the internal safety of trusting themselves, being proud of themselves, knowing that they have needs and sensitivities, but they have a right to understand and protect, they are less driven towards, I've seen it called cheap dopamine versus expensive dopamine. And I feel that's a little bit derogatory, but just for comparison, like, the expensive or good dopamine is like nature, walking, exercise, good social connection. And the cheap stuff is, well, stuff that's available to us, like social media, food, drink, drugs, all that jazz.
Yeah, it's stuff that, like, to go out in nature would feel really good to have done that. But in the moment when you're deciding whether to go out for a walk and get exercise and fresh air or sit on your phone and play Candy Crush, I know which one's
Speaking from
easier.
experience, Sacha.
Yeah, honestly, well, I was going to say, like, just as an example, say you're addicted to like playing games on your phone, or scrolling through social media and stuff. And so the minute there's like a gap in your productivity, for example, if you're in the middle of something, and then the next thing you know, it's almost like being on autopilot. You suddenly realize, oh, I'm on my phone again.
2 hours later, you're still
It's
playing it.
crazy.
Yeah.
It's a real issue for me. And yeah, so what would be the sort of safety alternative? Like, what would you say is missing from someone's perception of safety if that is their kind of go-to behavior?
That is a great question. And what's interesting, like procrastination, for example, that situation, what's missing from an internal safety, that is on an individual basis. So the coaching that I do, we would look at, is it external environment? Like, do you need just habits to put your phone away? So it's just not a temptation. So you've got other visual cues. So it's like a nice sign saying, like, Sophie, you have 10 minutes between calls. You don't need to be on your phone. Go, I don't water a plant.
Yeah.
Like maybe that would be useful for you most of the time. However, there will be times where you might want to be moving towards something that a visual cue is not going to help you, because actually there's a shame piece or a fear piece that needs a bit more internal work. So on an individual basis, like it could be from, somewhere in that range. Little things that people can try to see if it is just a little bit of visual stuff is, prepping your environment, because conscious decision making is hard in the moment. It takes resources and it takes energy. So we are going to go on autopilot. We have 95% of the decisions we make are unconscious. And so our environment is going to, dictate some of that unconscious behavior. So is there anything you can do in your environment to support you moving through the day without you having to like consciously decide on absolutely everything that you're doing? Because it's exhausting. And like, and if you've got a weaker prefrontal cortex, it's just not going to happen. So something like that is like, if you really struggle to get off your phone, can you do something different? Like, I don't know, play Tetris, because it's actually Tetris, weirdly. I don't know where I saw this, so I mean, I might be wrong, but I'm sure like people playing Tetris helped with PTSD. So it's like, can you replace the habit before you can do it completely, or can you get the phone out the place, or can you do something to help?
I mean, I will caveat that by saying the game that I'm addicted to is Tetris. So that doesn't work for me. It's this like, I can't remember what it's called. I'm not even going to tell people because I don't want other people to get addicted to it. But yeah, it's like a Tetris game where you like, make blocks to get rid of, lines of blocks. And do you know what? Like, there's been so many times when I've been like, right, I'm gonna leave my phone in the living room when I go to bed. I'm not going to take it into the bedroom with me. And that's worked. And then I've just kind of forgotten that. And then
we get back into those habits, don't we? That's the thing.
It's tricky, like making sustainable change. I guess like for me, it gets to a point where it's just ridiculous. And then you need, it gets to its like breaking point, like a rock bottom, so to speak, in your mental health or your productivity. And then I'm like, all right, enough. The app's being deleted. But yeah, it takes a lot. It's hard work.
Yeah, it is hard work. And, I think it's really important for people to realize that no habit is sustainable. I was thinking about this in the car. I've not done yoga much this year. I did it for
No.
2 years in some regularity, some level of like persistent and consistent. I
Mm,
just, I just can't do it right now. And I was thinking, okay, right, no shame, no guilt. The problem is I have stopped doing something that supported my regulation. So I've got two options. I can either address the barriers to that particular activity and see what I need to get back into it, or pick something that's got the same outcomes. Because a
mm,
lot of the time, I think we're trying to change our habits without having a clue why.
mm.
Like, what's the intrinsic motivation? Like, actually, how much is Tetris helping your nervous system?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah,
Question.
like how much is it? How much is it taking away from screen time? Like, do you need blue light glasses after a certain time? Or is it this, that, and the other? Is the shame and the internal conflict about being on it and wanting to pull away, is that taking more resource than being like, ah, this is fine, and I'm going to add in some extra habits. I don't actually need to spend all my energy taking this habit away because let's say it could be, if it was a shame wound, you let go of the shame, you've got more space to go add something in, add that walk in, and
Mm.
then have that downtime on the block game. Because I think this is the idea as well. We've got this internalized view of what normal functioning is and all the shoulds. We've got all the Instagrammable stuff of how we do things. Now, I work with some absolutely exceptional business people and people who operate on levels on scales that I don't operate on. And they need support getting showered and getting their pants on in the day.
Mm.
And,
Very
and
much.
it's being able to embrace the difference between what your level of operating actually is and what skills, routines, and supports you need to do it, which is also self-acceptance.
Well, this is what I was going to say because anyone who's had neurodiversity in their life or they are neurodiverse or they know someone who's neurodiverse will know how a neurodiverse person, how different they feel. And once they realize they're neurodiverse or, it's told, they find out for an assessment, it is a level of acceptance. It's not, it's great to have that knowledge, like,
Mhm.
that's something about you, but that feeling, particularly when you start to look back at, if you've an adult that's found out that you've become, that you've got a neurodiversity, you're now starting to put together all the pieces of the puzzle of, you know, why you felt different as a child, why you weren't very good at school, all those different things. And then it kind of reimagines that trauma again somehow. And like you say, like being actually okay with certain systems that you've put in place for yourself that do give you that safety. You have to, again, it's all about that acceptance is really difficult sometimes.
100%. And I say this to clients a lot of the time. I think there's a perception that you can just change your beliefs. Now, I, I've not seen science on this directly, but this has been my observation. So this is what I use with clients. If you have a belief like there's something wrong with me because I'm different,
Mm.
as a child, that's what and how you show up and how your fight or flight system shows up to try and protect you from that, to make you more quote normal. If you've got a belief that I'm not worthy or I'm wrong or I'm broken or I'm different, you can't just flip to the other one. There's a belief, then there's a grief, and then you can do the other one. You have to grieve that version of you who believed that painful part. And that's why it's so difficult because people are like, oh, I call getting an ADHD diagnosis grief because there's like the grief and relief
Yeah, yeah.
in one, because you can't operate under that new belief system without realizing that, intentional or otherwise, because some people have gone through significant abuse trauma that people um have been perpetrators in.
Mm.
However, there are other people who haven't. And, so there's a lot of parents who are realizing the way they approached certain things. If they had better information at the time, they would have done better. But that was the way of operating. That was the way of parenting. That was the way of disciplining. That's the way of getting the behaviors and the education into the children. Like, Sophie, the education system. I'm sure you've got a view on what's working for kids and what's not. And neurodivergent or otherwise, just general humans, like what works and what doesn't. So yeah, the acceptance doesn't come without a processing, and it's really important to be supported through that grief.
Absolutely. Slightly moving on from that, like there's a thing called RSD, rejection sensitivity dysmorphia, which again feels like quite a new term. I've only sort of come to know it in the last sort of 18 months. And that being seems to be a prevalent thing among people with ADHD. I don't know if it's specifically attached to ADHD as a thing, but certainly something that people are talking about. Can you explain a little bit about what RSD is and why there's such a link between ADHD and RSD?
Yes. So rejection sensitive dysphoria is a great terminology so people can realize they're not alone, and that big feeling of rejection when somebody behaves in a particular way or doesn't behave in a particular way makes total sense. What I will say is, going back to Sophie's question at the beginning around ADHD and trauma, from everything that I've seen, it's more useful to see RSD as complex PTSD.
Mhm.
Because what we're saying is that individual, for whatever reason, growing up in their family of origin or community of origin, did not feel safe enough to be their authentic selves, to get their sensitivities met. I'm going to use just a really bland example, but it's only in my late 30s my parents changed the lights in the kitchen that was so uncomfortable for me. Like, I didn't have language for that as a child. Obviously, they weren't the same lights, but the idea of getting your needs met or not, and in that social setting. So maybe someone has been told repeatedly, you're too loud, or stop being silly, or stop interrupting. And what we do when we're children is we don't have a prefrontal cortex, which is the assessment part. It is the processing part. So we say, I express myself, I've got negative feedback, I am the problem. So I'm going to change me to prevent that happening. So that's kind of like the basis of this CPTSD. And that's why it's a little C, complex PTSD, which is that one which is a series of events rather than like one big event that distress the nervous system. It's like a series of events where an identity starts to form about the self, about their needs, and about their emotions. And going back to what we said earlier, who was taught good emotional health and hygiene? Because again, I'm yet to meet an adult who's got through. Again, maybe it's communities that I'm in.
Mm.
However, I believe there's a level of parenting style which is now shifting away from the relationship to emotions the way it was to actually realizing that emotional data needs to be dealt with differently, because when we're in an emotion, prefrontal cortex is less accessible. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like, yeah, we need to be like, you're safe with this emotion. So there's a lot of parents that didn't realize, just being like, it's okay, I'm with you, I got you,
Mm.
instead of, no, don't worry, or dismissing or adding logic, or, well, no, but we're going to be late for grandma's. And
Mm.
it's like, what? The child's like processing this big uncomfortable feeling and with this logic, and what does that mean? And not actually having the tools, because we don't realize generally that we're such complex beings that we are actually meant to regulate as children via the calm, safe, regulated nervous system of the adults in our lives.
Yeah, and
So,
it's so interesting as well how we kind of take on the role of those adults in our own lives when we grow up, and maybe some of the sort of shame and blame and even anger or aggression or rejection in some form that we experienced as children, we then turn that on ourselves as adults. And yeah, it's about, as you were saying, nowadays with parenting, we're moving slightly more towards sort of like validating
mhm.
children's feelings. It's more like, I can see that you're really upset about that, and that's understandable, but we need to do this now, or whatever it might be. And yeah, I guess it's the first step in your own dysregulation is kind of validating your own feelings and shedding that shame and that blame of like, oh, I should be doing more work, or I shouldn't have sent that text to that person, or I shouldn't have emailed my boss like that. And yeah, and just sort of like being more compassionate and being the adults we should have had growing up.
100%. And it's one of the biggest interventions that I see people having. We talk about internal safety. Well, exactly as you're saying, Sophie, if you can mess up and still maintain that self-love and that self-compassion, what have you got to fear?
Mm.
Your
Yeah.
nervous system's going to feel safe with yourself. And, people might call that inner child work, or there's many different approaches to that same piece. And, I love the fact that you use the word compassion, because all of the research shows that compassion has the biggest healing on HRV. If you come across HRV as a measure.
I personally haven't. Have you, Jess?
No.
So heart rate variability that's for all the nerds. It's a great thing that you can measure as an individual to see the health of your nervous system. So I was talking about like that top of the ladder, feeling safe. Well, that's governed by your vagus nerve. Now, we can think of the vagus nerve as a muscle. So the more compassionate you are to yourself, the stronger that vagus nerve is going to be, because you're safe to be yourself with yourself. And then if you can stand up for yourself around other people, you're safe to be around other people. Now, it doesn't start in isolation. It starts in safe co-regulation with other people, by the way. So I think it's really, I don't want to use the word toxic. It's really not useful for everybody to hear things that they feel they should be doing on their own, because we heal in community and we heal in relationship. Because if we're damaged in relationship, we need to heal in relationship. That's different to codependency. I know I've gone off track. I'll try and loop back, but we'll see where we go. So yeah, it's really important to realize that compassion is super important. As I said, HRV, I remembered where it was. So your HRV is your heart rate variability. So if you think about your heart rate, it's different to beats per minute. It's the time between each heartbeat. So boom, boom. It's that timepiece. Now, when you're in fight or flight, or you're in that shutdown, it's more regular. Boom, boom, boom. Now, you might think that has an advantage. You are like clockwork. It's not actually. What we want is a nice, relaxed little variable between them. Boom, boom, boom. And there's a different number between those two. They're not uniform. It's the time between the beats. Now, because that's dictated by the vagus nerve, it means you're relaxed, you're chilled, you don't need to be sending your resources like that because you're in threat. And that's a number that you can take. So I use Optimal HRV, fantastic company, 100% research based. There's the founders are based in, I think, social work, psychology, and a doctor at Harvard doing all this together. It's fantastic. And they found compassion is the thing that can really improve your HRV, which is, the strength of your vagus nerve, how safe you feel in your body. And that's something that I think Apple takes a number on, but I do know it's not as accurate as optimal HRV. But for an individual, you can take a reading and you can see, if we think about stress builds up over the day and then sleep is when we're meant to go into rest and repair. If you're working correctly, not correctly, but like optimally, you will get a number of HRV. It's actually the higher the number, the better. You want to think about like how full is your tank? How much of a stress hangover do you have? Or how much of your stress have you processed? Now, things like RSD being triggered, or anxiety or perfectionism, or all of these things being triggered, will accumulate throughout the day. And ideally, you're meant to be able to sleep it off and start again. However, that doesn't usually, people who struggle with those things tend to struggle how to sleep. So it's like, However, going back to compassion and all the things that we know, like being in nature, safe people, all that jazz, but you've got a measurable thing. You can take that number in the day and you can see, how am I doing? Can I be compassionate to myself? Do I have a lot in the tank? Or do I actually need to take things slower? Do I need to look after myself? And you can build a relationship to yourself through that data, and you can see how it improves over time. You can see, does doing a bit of Tetris before bed help me, or does that hinder me? And you've got something that can support you to see how safe you're feeling inside of your body. Essentially, how's your body processing stress? How are you doing?
It's really interesting, because I've been reading a book over the last few days by, I don't know if you know Kimberly Snyder. She wrote a book called the hidden powers of the five hearts.
Mm,
Five hearts? Yeah, five hearts. Or four, no, five hearts, I think. And it's more about sort of like heart brain coherence and
mhm.
how you move into different like heart stages and stuff. And it's slightly more esoteric in terms of what you were talking about. But it's yeah, it's that kind of like when you're in that fight or flight, or you're dysregulated, or you're feeling triggered or rejected, you go into what she would call like the dark heart, where your
Mm,
heart brain called coherence is completely dysregulated as well. And we do find it harder to make decisions and to be rational and to communicate and do all of those things. So it's all kind of tied together. And I know there's sort of meditations and stuff you can do to try and increase your heart brain coherence throughout the day and stuff. But yeah, it sounds very similar to what you were kind of talking about.
but yeah, it sounds like super aligned that when we're out of alignment or mismatch, something takes us out of ourselves, mind, body, emotion, like all of it's working together, either when you feel safe or when you don't. And then there's a result. There's an experience on both of those things. So yeah, it sounds super aligned.
Mm. Yeah, I'm just wondering, so obviously you sort of focus on business coaching and coaching businesses and business owners who struggle with ADHD or the symptoms of ADHD. Could you just talk a little bit about how these symptoms manifest, and what are some of the challenges that businesses and business owners typically face because of these symptoms? Like, I'm sure that there'll be people listening that can kind of relate and be like, oh yeah, I do that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a great question. And do you know what? Before I enter the specifics, basically what we've spoke about is
Mm,
what we look at, because essentially doesn't matter what job you're in. If you're working for somebody else, if you are experiencing anxiety, procrastination, overthinking, perfectionism, like impulsivity, rejection sensitivity, it's just going to be straight up not a great time for you. However, you've got security generally from your paycheck if you're not putting your job in jeopardy of actually losing the security of your paycheck. However, when you're a business owner or an entrepreneur, how you show up directly is your security. So ultimately, somebody's behaviors, it might be, oh, I don't want to raise my prices because I want to help everyone, or I don't want to lose the customers that I do have, or so there might be a relationship to money which we would explore, because actually when we really get to the root of it, relationship to money is relationship to security, it's relationship to self, it's relationship to worth. So if there's a financial problem, there's probably a self-worth problem. So we'll look at that. If there's money coming in, but it's going out all the time, we might look at that impulsivity, and we look at the regulation around impulsivity. Let's look at, sometimes we even do, we have a entrepreneur avatar, and we just let that avatar make the decisions. We have to run it through the avatar first. It's like, okay, who are you? Who are your values? What are your business values? Come on, what's the entrepreneur version of you? And then allowing that person a bit of a pause to before they make a rash decision, because they don't want to make a decision if they're in rejection sensitivity or impulsivity or feeling down on themselves. It's giving some objectivity to make a decision, or procrastination on something that they know that they want to move towards, but there's maybe feelings of guilt or shame. Even going to the simple things that we were speaking about before, which is, what environment do you need for your business to actually operate well? And it is. So my personal approach is internal environment and external environment. Now, what I mean by that is, internal environment is usually dealt with in therapy spaces, and external environment is generally dealt with in coaching
mm,
spaces. As a rule of thumb, I know there's nuance everywhere, and both modalities are developing at a really fast rate. However, me personally, there has to be a holistic approach to both to get results, I would say. So I don't know if that answers your question in terms of the people who would be like, oh, that's me. But yeah, generally it is looking at how deep is the wound, and therefore what type of intervention do we need? Is it surface, a bit deeper? And then the intervention would basically just follow from what's discovered inside of the sessions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it totally makes sense. And, I'm sure there are lots of people listening who'd be thinking, where can I find out how to talk to Sasha about these things? So could you tell
Mm.
us, how do people get in touch with you?
Usually by Instagram, but as now as an ADHD business owner who's actually employed help, there will be more multiple platforms. But yeah, mainly Instagram. So that's like at Sasa Harper. It's spelt a little funky. But yeah,
Yeah.
mainly Instagram. I do have a website, myname.com. But yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. It's so honestly, we could talk to you for hours and hours because it's such a fascinating subject. It's something that we talk about a lot.
Yeah, yeah. So
And so
true.
yeah, it's really nice to hear from you and hear about all the different sort of technical sides of this thing. And I'm sure lots of people listening will be really intrigued to hear more from you and find out more about you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on, Sasha.
Thank you for having me.